The last several weeks we've been in Matthew 14. Guess where we're at today? Matthew 14. So just stay there. Turn to Matthew chapter 14 around verse 22 roughly. Our focal verses is actually 28 through 31, but we're going to read a little bit more than that. Over the last few weeks we talked about getting our feet wet and walking by faith, because that's what Peter did. Got out of the boat. I've told you this message was inspired by John Orberg, and if you want to get out of if you want to get your feet, how did I get it? You have to get out of the boat to get your feet wet. That's not the right title of the book, but that's as close as I can come right now this morning. I'm lucky to get that out. It's not been a illustrious beginning, but I hope we'll have a strong finish. Have you ever had that sinking feeling in your life that you're going under and you're not sure what to do? Like I said, the last few weeks we talked about being a water walker, why we find contentment in the boat, the wet feet principle, key decisions storms have to force us to do things in life, and the cost of living in fear. And today I want to talk about that sinking feeling. Jesus has just fed 5,000 people, shared with them. The sun's getting ready to set. And in verse 22 it says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. I've explained this to you before. We're not talking about the short end going across. They're at the northern end. He wants them to go to the southern end of the lake, okay? Which is the longest part of the lake. While he sent the people home. And after sending them home, Jesus, went up into the hills by himself to pray. He often did that after a large gathering. Which reminds us, side note, when you're in spiritual battle and there's a lull in the fighting, you need to get alone and catch your breath and reload and just relax a little bit. And Jesus went up onto the hill alone to pray. Night fell, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. And in fear they cried out, "It's a ghost." But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Verse 28. I've underlined this passage for you on the screen. Then Jesus called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus says. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong winds and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Notice the first 4 words in verse 31. Immediately, or Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. There wasn't a hesitation in Jesus' walking. He reached out and just grabbed Peter when he called out to him. You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why do you doubt me?" And when they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. "You are the Son of God," they exclaimed. We're going to talk about this sinking feeling that Peter's going through. And we've all been there, right? We've all had that sinking feeling in our lives. Toddlers. Do you remember when you were 1 year old? One years old? I don't remember. But my youngest grandchild is now 3. Trust me, she's walking just fine. But I was watching her walk. Have you ever watched a toddler start to walk? Do they ever fall to the ground and say, "I'm not going to get up again. This walking thing is for the birds"? You know, they get up, they wobble, they fall. They stand up, they roll over, they stumble, they fall. Every time they keep failing and failing and failing till one day what? They begin to walk. So why do we see failure in our lives as a time to give up. Why aren't we more like toddlers? So we fell down, or we fall down quite a bit. Now, as we get older, we know why we don't fall down very much, because it hurts. And they're closer to the ground than we are. I get that. But something about the fact we give up, we grow older. We seem to grow more afraid of falling. And so we would rather avoid falling down, so we never learn to walk. But I see Peter here as a water toddler. A water toddler. He was willing to risk failure in his life for the adventures of trusting in Jesus. His step, like his faith, was a bit uncertain though, right? He wobbled as he joined Jesus walking on the water. Wouldn't you wobble? Have you ever walked on water? I haven't. But I can only imagine if you hadn't, I wonder what kind of feeling that would be. Jesus also, I want you to notice what Jesus didn't do. Jesus didn't treat Peter's failure as a ground for dismissing him. Jesus takes Peter's faith seriously. He has him come to him. But Peter still had some things to learn. And Jesus reaches out. He rescues him. Now, I want you to notice what Jesus said. I don't think he's scolding Peter here. You have such little faith. I don't think that was the case at all. Jesus rescues Peter, and then he diagnosed the problem in Peter's life. There's a diagnosis here. Jesus immediately reaches out and grabs him, and he says to him, "You have so little faith. What did you doubt me?" That's the diagnosis. You understand what I'm saying? He's not chastising Peter for his lack of faith. He's revealing where Peter stands in his faith. Folks, so many times we fail in our spiritual lives, right? Say yes. It feels like such a failure. Jesus said, don't worry about it. You have little faith. You got to keep growing. You got to keep growing. Let's look at King David. King David knew what it was to walk on water, sort of. Look at the life of King David. He trusted God, and he was on his way to the palace. And then, one by one, all that was given to him was taken away. David lost his job as a commander. He lost his job as a musician. He lost his job as a giant slayer. The king, which used to be his father-in-law, King Saul took his wife, which was his daughter, away from him and gave her to somebody else. David fled to his spiritual mentor, who was Samuel, the prophet. But he had to leave him behind, and soon after, Samuel died. His spiritual advisor passes away. So he runs to his best friend, Jonathan, who is Saul's son, but John wouldn't leave his father's side. He's lost everything. The failure of his marriage, his job, his mentor, his friend, and it only gets worse from there. He fled his home and ran to Gath. You know where Gath is? Gath is where Goliath and his cousins lived. He ran to his enemy's hometown. Then, to get there, he had to pretend he was crazy and out of his mind. Well, he had to leave there. He didn't find refuge there. David ran once more to a cave called Adullam. Adullam. The cave is called Adullam. But we might think it's the cave of failures. Please hear me, Adullam does not mean failure. But for David, it might as well have said, welcome to failure. The darkest cave there is in Israel. Because that's where David ran. The cave is where sometimes you and I end up. when our props are gone, our support's gone, our crutches have been stripped away. The cave is where we find ourselves when we thought we were doing great things and it didn't work out as we had hoped it would. Are you in the cave right now? Are you in the cave of failure right now? Perhaps you are in the cave because of some foolish choices. Maybe you're in the cave because of circumstances you had no control of. But I would suspect that you're in the cave because of a little bit of both. Sometimes foolish choices create circumstances that are beyond our control. And if you're not in the cave right now, just wait. You'll get there. If you got out of the cave, don't worry, you'll probably end up going back in there. But the hardest thing about being in the cave is you begin to wonder if God lost track of you. Right? There's one thing we need to know. The cave is where God does some of His best work in our lives. You know that what you discover in the cave? You discover that everything has been stripped away from you. And you got nothing but God. And you want to know what's best about the cave? None of that other stuff matters because all you have now is God in your life. You see where I'm going with that? When you find that the only thing you have is God, you find that God is probably all you need. How do people in the cave of failure find strength to get out? When in the cave of failure, listen to me, when in the cave of failure, honestly, face and name your discouragement. Face and name your discouragement. David knew all about failure. Hiding out for more than 10 years. 10 years he's hiding out in caves. This is a man after God's own heart. He's not even a king. For 10 years. He took refuge in the village of Ziklag. He had about 600 men with him. They called them his fighting men. And they went on a raid, and when they returned, their entire household was taken, including their families. The men, those 600 men, were not happy. They were grieving. They were weeping. They were weeping so hard, the Bible says they had no more strength to grieve. And then David's men's grief turned to anger. And you know where that anger turned to? To David. 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. Great verse. Believe it or not, this is a great verse. David was now in great danger because all of his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk about stoning him. But here's the best part of the verse. I underlined it for you. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Everything, this poor guy, everything's taken away from him. He's got 600 fighting men, and now they're ready to stone him. David finds strength in the Lord his God. This is the secret of a spiritual life. When other resources are gone, when everything has been taken away, you and I can find strength in the Lord. David started facing and naming his discouragement. Here's what we do. I'm going to back up just a little bit. I'm such a failure. And we think we have named our discouragement and honestly faced it. No, you know what we're doing? We're having a pity party. I am such a failure, God. You know what? When you were born, He knew you were going to be a failure. And that's why He died, to save you from your sins. Okay? He's taking care of your failures. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know how bad you feel about yourself right now. I don't know if you think you're a failure. This morning, I can't tell you how I felt. I felt like a failure. I wasn't prepared. I thought I was, but I wasn't. But get this. This is why God came to earth to begin with. Took on human flesh to take care of this. Our problem is we just blanket that we are a failure and we put it in our head and we replay it over and over and over and over and over again until finally we start thinking it. But we never have an honest, we don't honestly face our discouragement and face it and name it. I want you to take a look what what David does in Psalms 142. This is a psalm for cave dwellers, okay? David says, I cry out to the Lord. I plead to the Lord of mercy. I pour out my complaints before Him. I tell Him my troubles. Whenever I'm overwhelmed, you alone know the way I should turn. Wherever I go, my enemies have set traps for me. I want you to notice that David has poured out his heart to God. In fact, most of the categories of the Psalms deal with people lamenting. In fact, we have one whole book of the Bible called Lamentations. Don't you think God has broad enough shoulders for you to come and complain to Him? See, my God is big enough that I know I can go to complain to Him. I sooner or later run out of things to complain about till I realize I'm in the presence of somebody I don't need to complain about at all. We need to honestly face and name those discouragements. Let me ask you, have you discovered your spiritual gift to complaining? I'm almost convinced that that's a spiritual gift. If you can complain, listen, if you know how to complain, you can do this. If you know how to complain, you can honestly face and name your discouragements. I'm a great complainer. I didn't realize how good I was. I can go to God and complain. He loves me and values me even when I'm in the cave of failure. I've told this story before. I wasn't going to do it, but I'm going to do it now. I did it before. You've heard it before. Getting ready to go to seminary, Stephen and I. Stephen was only like this tall, and he's like this tall. And we're on our way. We took some stuff, our first load of furniture to seminary and unload it. And I came back. We did one more last hurrah with the youth group that I was leading at camp. And from there, Gina and I, Alicia and Stephen, were going to leave to go to San Francisco. And we get a phone call on a Tuesday. We got there on a Saturday. Got a call on Tuesday that her father had terminal lung cancer. Small cell lung cancer. I immediately had one person in my family that didn't want to go to seminary. We've already moved. We've already made the decision. We have this great hurrah going. This is supposed to be the highlight of the ministry at a church that we're leaving, and we're getting ready to start another journey. We're getting ready to step out of the boat till we find out how bad the storm really is in our lives. And I was angry. Trust me, Gina knows I can be angry. I got angry. And I was angry at the situation. I was angry at her father. I was angry at the cancer. I was angry at God to make us have to go 600, 700 miles away. Now we may have to change all of that plan. We sold our house. I was angry. You know what I did? I went onto a little hill out in the pasture someplace on the ranch because I was so angry. The kids, the youth couldn't see me this angry, right? And I cried, and I complained, and I yelled, and I got mad at God, and I complained some more, till finally there was nothing more to complain about until God says, I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Complain all you want. My grace is sufficient. And if I could do that to him, so can you. I had to ask a lot of forgiveness because I was so angry. And you know what? He took that forgiveness and turned it and restored me. We had a great week that week. We did go back to Tucson. It took a couple more weeks to get there. But everything turned out okay. We had 5 deaths in our family in 2 years while we were at seminary. Her father was one of them. So honestly face and name your discouragement. Because then you have to do the second thing, and that's what we did. The second thing is you need to take action. When you're in the cave, you eventually have to take action. You can become so paralyzed with your discouragement because you fail to understand what was involved in the failure in the first place. Then you fail to take action towards that change, and so you wait for some sort of outside influence to rescue you, and guess what? Most of the time, that doesn't happen. But God is waiting and willing to help you when you start to take action. Somebody wrote this, and I like what it had to say, so I decided to use it, all right? I don't know how spiritual it is, but I think you can see a spiritual connection if you stay with me. A guy by the name of David Burns, a psychologist, describes what he calls the cycle of liturgy. When you face the challenge, you do nothing. That begins a cycle. You do nothing. It leads to what is called distorted thoughts. I'm helpless. I'm hopeless. I'm beyond change. Distorted thoughts. These thoughts then lead to what is called destructive emotions. A loss of energy, motivation, damaged self-esteem, a feeling of being overwhelmed, destructive emotions. The result is self-defeating behaviors. Self-defeating behavior, procrastination, avoidance, escapism. These behaviors then reinforce all of the negative thoughts, and guess what? You end up doing nothing, and the cycle keeps going and going and going. Here's the good news, though. God has made us in such a way that taking one single step of action can be extremely powerful. One single step can rob failure of its power. One small step of action is often worth 100 internal pep talks that you can have with yourself. Just one simple step. Imagine Peter climbing out of the boat, taking one simple step. Got 11 disciples that didn't do anything. They're still caught in fear. He sees Jesus and says, "Can I come out there? Command me to come out there, because I know you can command me to come out. Come on out." And he slips over the side of the boat and begins to walk. Changed his life. One single step changes Peter's life. What about you? The alternative to taking action is passivity and resignation. Are you familiar with the character Eeyore? What's his name? I can't even think of his name now. Christopher Robin's 100 Acre Wood, Penny the Pooh, Eeyore. Eeyore, one of probably the most pessimistic characters that we know of. He wards off the pain of discouragement by renouncing hope. But you can know that that's not God's will for your life. That is not what God intended for your life. I have another story here about failure can drive you to make changes that would lead to new learnings. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Outward Bound. But this morning I was thinking and reading through this, and I go, we're dealing with Eeyore as an illustration of procrastination, pessimism, down in his luck, in a deep cave like David. So I thought, what is the most optimistic cartoon character I could think of? And you know what I came up with? Wile E. Coyote. I can't think of a more optimistic guy in cartoon character in my life, trying to chase down this stupid roadrunner. He keeps the Acme business in business. You know, rocks fall on his head. He gets exploded. He runs off a cliff. He gets hit by trains. He gets hit by buses. And you know what? He never gives up. He fails. And what's he do the next day? He gets up and he does it again. You go, at some point you start feeling sorry for the guy. But think about it. Each step he's failing, he's just found another way. He couldn't do it. I hate to say that I don't want to ruin. Right now, I don't know if he ever catches that roadrunner. You almost wish he does sometimes, don't you? But think about it. Here's a guy, fictitious. I get it, but I wanted you to have the understanding of how God wants us to behave. So when that discouragement sticks out his tongue and goes beep beep at you, take a step. Honestly face your discouragement and name it. Take action. And guess what? Use failure as a teacher. Use failure as a teacher. There's a book entitled Art and Fear that shows how indispensably failure is tied to learning. There's an illustration here about a ceramic teacher who divides her class into two separate groups. One of the groups are graded solely based on quantity. The more pots they put out, the higher their grade. So if they put out 50 pots, they will be graded on the amount of pots that they create. The second group isn't going to deal with quantity, they're going to deal with quality. They have to make the best pot, all-around pot, for cooking, serving, and all the best pot. They can only make one pot, but it has to be the best pot. The better the pot, the higher the grade. You know what they found? That the people who were putting out the more pots and putting out more quantity ended up making the better pot. The other group spent hours trying to figure out what kind of pot would be the best pot. But they could only make one. And it was just so-so compared to this other. They were making out so many pots in this one, eventually they figured out what worked for them. So their pot, towards the end, was better than that one pot that was made. Why? Because they kept failing. It didn't matter. They failed. They were going to get it right. And they had all these pots. You see where I'm going with this? They allow failure of making the pot to be able to make the best pot. And this group over here spent most of their time trying to figure out what the best pot was and really didn't do anything. So we not only need to take action, that's what taking that step. We also have to take action. We're going to fail. We're going to fail. Anybody here not fail at anything? I want to see if anybody has not failed at anything. I just want to see if anybody here did not fail. I failed my first exam at seminary. I told you the story. I failed my first exam at seminary. I got a 58 on a multiple guess test. I don't fail multiple guess tests. I might make a bad grade, but I never fail. I was so angry. I'm thinking, why am I here? My faculty advisor is the one teaching the class. So, I can't make him too mad. I didn't care. I'm gonna fix this. I don't know how I passed the class, but I got to the point where I passed it. Then I come to find out, everybody else failed it too, but they handled it differently. I decided to take action to do something about it. Somehow or another, I graduated with a 3.0, barely, average. And I was thinking, if I'm going to do anything else, I got to at least get to a 3.0 if I'm going to continue on with any other education. But folks, listen, it's okay to fail. It's not the end of the world. It is if you don't take action to fix it. God doesn't want you to stay there. And failure is a good teacher. I don't care how many pots you have to take. Allow this to be a teaching situation. I would guess that Peter's water walking wasn't perfect. And after it was all done, Jesus helped him learn from his failure. What did he need to do? He needed to improve and strengthen his faith. David was in another cave where he learned some failure. One day Saul brought 3,000 soldiers. He had 600 men. David had 600 men. Saul has 3,000 men. You can do the math. 5-1 odds, right? Not good. He came to a sheep pen where there was a cave. It said that the Bible delicately says that Saul had to go into the cave to relieve himself. That's how delicately he puts it, right? Deeper in the cave is David's 600 men and David. And you can almost say, get him. Go get him. He's right there. He's your enemy. You can take care of him right now. You know why David didn't kill Saul? 2 reasons. One, God didn't know not to do it. That's a good reason right there. But Saul was still God's ordained man for Israel. And he wasn't going to touch God's anointed. And he was going to do what God says. So he said no. He had the opportunity. He didn't do it. And in the cave that David has been in, he has discovered more than what he obviously he's going to become king. He doesn't know that yet. He was told he's been that. But he found out being king is not the important part. You know what's the important part? Doing and being with God. Finding your strength in the Lord. I have known people who've been through failure after failure after failure, and they're smiling, they're hopeful, they're encouraged. You know why? Because they're close to God. They found their strength in the Lord. Allow this to be a time of teaching. The cave of failure offers a precious chance to learn, but are we willing to ask the courageous questions? And here's the courageous questions. Am I chasing the right dreams? Is what I'm pursuing consistent with what God's calling for me in my life? Am I operating out of what God made me to do or out of my own need for appearing to be important? Am I willing to remain in the cave if it means being true to God? And finally this morning, in the cave, we need to find ultimate refuge in God. We need to find ultimate refuge in God. Finding ultimate refuge in God means you become so immersed in His presence, so convinced in His goodness, so devoted to His lordship that you find even in the cave is a perfectly safe place to be because He's there with you. It's a great statement. Sometimes you're in a cave. You know what? Human effort is unable to get you out. There are some things you can't fix. There are some things that can't be healed. There are some times you can't escape. All you can do is to trust God. David knew what that was like. We know that David won't die in a cave. We know that there's a crown ahead for David. But you know what? David doesn't know that. All he knows in this cave is as good. This could be as good as it gets for him. But he makes one of the greatest discoveries in Psalms 142, verses 4 and 5, which we didn't read. I want to read now. He says, I look for someone to come and help me. but no one gives me the passing thought. King David, no one gives him the passing thought. No one will help me. No one cares a bit what happens to me. Then I pray to you, O Lord. I say, you are my place of refuge. You are all I really want in life. You see what the cave brought David to? That regardless of all the trappings and all the power and all the positions and all the money and all the wealth and all the things that we are running after, he has found that all he needs in life is God Himself. It's God Himself. God does some of His best work in caves. One of His best work was in a cave. Jesus suffered like you and me. In fact, He probably suffered more than we do. He understands that seeking feeling even more than David or Peter or you and I. No one has ever descended into the depths of despair and discouragement the way Jesus did. Jesus gave up His position in heaven. He gave up His status as a teacher. He gave up His safety and security. He lost not only His best friend or friends, but all of His friends, in spite of His teaching and His warnings. His life was endangered, but it got worse. He went to a cross and He died. And when He died, all the dreams that He inspired appeared to die with Him. And what started out as a shining success ended like an incredible failure at first. But then they put His body in a cave. His body was there for 3 days, but they couldn't keep Him there. They forgot what we sometimes forget, that God does His best work in a cave. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank You so much for dying for us and the work that You do in our caves. Help us to face and name our discouragement to You. Let us cast our cares upon You. Father, let us just understand that failure can be a teacher for us. Father, You want so much more in our lives. You want to give us. We need so much. Sometimes we're paralyzed. We just can't take that step of action that we need to. And so I ask, Father, that You give us the courage and the fortitude, the strength, the motivation to take one simple step of faith. Allow failure to be our teacher. Help us find that ultimately You're all we need in life. Father, thank You for the work that You do in our caves. And I pray this and ask this in Jesus' name and give thanks to Jesus. Amen. I'm going to ask you to stand, and what we're going to do is every week we have a call of invitation, a call of commitment. And I'm just going to ask you to come as we sing. You know this song. I want the ladies are going to be singing. I'll be helping you lead a little bit. I'm going to ask you to come to the altar if you need to. If you have a decision to make, you come as we sing.